Are you ready, Father?
You want to call attention to any of these pages?
Technician.
Bob?
Yeah, I am. Whose is that? No, no, I'm gonna use this one. What I'm going to use are the two sheets that you had in your little packet of materials. The one on this chart, and use the bottom part of it, and then what's considered page 4 on conference number 2, which also gives a brief historical account of the Institute. What I'll try to do is, in real woman fashion, put a little flesh and blood on this whole thing for you. And I'd like to start by just saying a few words about Father Gemelli and Armida Borelli, whom you have already been told were and are considered as our founders. Father Gemelli, the Franciscan, probably many of you know something about. He was a Milanese friar. He began his life as a medical doctor. Actually came from a fairly well-to-do Milanese family, but an unbelieving family and an anti-clerical family. During his college years, he was a great socialist, one of the best speakers the socialists had in the environs of Milan. He came back into the church and credits his reconversion to the faith to a Dr. Vico Necchi, who was a Franciscan tertiary, and it was largely through his example when they were living together in the barracks and so on that made him realize the greatness of the faith and brought about his desire to return. After that, he decided that he wanted to become a friar, attracted to the friars because of their humility and their poverty. He was one of the most eligible bachelors in Milan at that time, and there was great consternation when he decided to enter the priesthood, particularly when he entered the friars. They all said that if he had wanted to become a Jesuit, those men were very well educated and he would be in his proper class, and that wouldn't have been so bad. But to become a friar, it was just almost unthinkable. One of the great contributions that he made to the Institute, I believe, was his firm belief in the laity and the role of the laity. He had been a layman for a number of years and saw what a lay person could do and could bring about in the world. He came to believe very much for the need of consecrated lay people, and he had great trust in what a consecrated layperson could do. He met Armida Borelli, who became our foundress, in 1910. She was also of a Milanese family, middle class but very wealthy, and a very well-educated family. Even her mother had gone to the university, and that was something unusual back in those days. Her father was an importer of art objects. This gave the family an opportunity to travel. She went to school in Menzingen in Switzerland. It was a school run by the Holy Cross Sisters. Here she came to know the Franciscans for the first time, the Capuchins. They had a Capuchin chaplain. And he taught her a great deal about St. Francis. He also told her that her name, Armida, was not a saint's name, and so if she should really have a saint's name. And in looking over some of the books on saints, she decided that the saint she really wanted to copy was Elizabeth of Hungary, because in 24 years Elizabeth had done tremendous things and had even become a saint. And so she took the name of Elizabeth then as her name. She also there met two young peasant girls who were sort of looked down on because they weren't of the same social class, and she decided to befriend them because they needed friends. They taught her a great devotion to the Sacred Heart. Both of these have great bearing on our own history. she decided that she wanted to enter the convent, and her family was very much upset to the point where they told her that they'd rather see her dead than to do one of two things, either enter the convent or be on the stage. And they took her out of school and kept her out for a year. She was smart enough to let all of this sort of simmer down, and at the end of the year they thought she'd forgotten it, and so they sent her back to school. She was the oldest in the family, a very gifted young woman and a very beautiful woman. She had many offers of matrimony and turned them all down. This caused great consternation in the family too, because the younger daughters couldn't marry until the oldest one did. And so they had many family squabbles, finally settled it by letting one of the younger ones get married. She came to know Father Gemelli because she had graduated from Menzingen and was working in what we would call a social service agency, a volunteer thing in Milan for abandoned children. She had a younger brother who was studying medicine, and he was about to become a Mason. This disturbed her, and she talked to the woman who was in charge of this foundling home, and the woman said, "Oh, I know just the person for you to go to see. There's a young friar in Milan who is a medical doctor. He's a great person. He would know how to approach your brother, and I think he's the one you should go to talk to." So she went to talk to Father Gemelli. He incidentally did talk to the brother, but he never succeeded in bringing him around, and the brother did die outside the church. But this was the beginning of a lifelong association between the two. He asked Armida then, she really asked him if there was any way in which she could help him. She was so grateful to him for what he was trying to do for her brother. He was trying to begin a neoclassical review, and he needed someone to translate from other languages. She knew French and German, and so was able to do this. And so this is how they began working together in the translation and the publication of the review. They worked together in a number of other projects, such as the consecration of all the soldiers during at the beginning of the war, their consecration of these soldiers to the Sacred Heart. When he went off to the front as a medical doctor, along with Dr. Vico Necchi and a Monsignor Olgiati, she said that she would make the promise that if they returned, she would enter the convent, if they returned safely. And he said, "No, you promise that when we return safely, we will all work together to further many of the projects that he had in mind." So each time she would say that she wanted to enter the convent, he would say, "No, you must not enter the convent. You must remain in the world. You must be a lay person, but you must be a saint." He was never her spiritual director, but they worked together until she died in 1952. Her organizational abilities were great, and they were well recognized, particularly by the Cardinal of Milan. He asked her to organize the young women of Milan into groups so they could come to know their faith better. At first she declined, and then she decided to do this. The organization in the Archdiocese of Milan was so successful that the Holy Father asked her to do this throughout Italy. This became the Feminine Youth of Catholic Action, and really brought about great miracles within the country of Italy. It was the members of this feminine youth who in 1948 worked so hard prior to the elections and the first time that women ever had a vote that they are largely credited with the election in Italy going for a republic rather than for either the socialist or the monarchical form of government. This feminine youth, which she brought into being, was the feeding ground for the Institute for many, many years. It was so organized that they began with what they called the Piccolissimi, the little ones from 3 years old up, and then it was graded so that until the time you were 25, you were part of this great feminine youth movement. And this meant that you could see a little 3-year-old and see the spark in her eye and follow her in an organized pattern until she was a woman old enough to come into the Institute. Many of the practices that were followed in feminine youth, there was nothing new really for a person to embrace the Institute life, because what she had been doing in feminine youth, she continued doing within the Institute. It was a tremendous feeding ground for us. Armida Borelli and Father Gemelli talked very much about the fact that there was great need for a group of consecrated lay people. Even the Holy Father told her, as far as the feminine youth was concerned, that he wanted holy women in the feminine youth, but he did not want nuns. When some of these women in feminine youth would talk to her about, well, what can we do now? We're growing out of this. Where do we go from here? She then went to him and asked him, him being the Holy Father, what could she do with these women? And he said, you must not make them nuns. They must not remain in the world as nuns. They must remain in the world as lay people. The place for them to be is connected with the third order. There was no place else for a lay person to go, but in and through the third order. That is how we came to have the very close connection that we have today with the third order. An interesting sidelight that is pertinent to our history, I believe, is this. There was a daughter of Charity who had been in her community for a number of years. She was a very gifted woman. She taught French and music for the community. They put her into some of the best spots in teaching positions in the various towns and in the various convents. She came to realize that the daughters were getting rather lax in their observance of the rule, and she wanted to bring about some type of reform. This didn't meet with approval as far as many of her superiors were concerned, and so instead of being sent to a very good mission here or a very good mission there, she began getting the little jobs, which she accepted without any problem. One of these took her to Rome, to a hospital, the property of which bordered the property of the Vatican. She was really a nurse's aide or something like that, I guess. Anyway, one of the jobs she had was to carry out the trash. And one morning she was taking the trash out to dump it, and she looked up, and Leo the 13th was looking out of his window, and she waved to him, and he waved back to her, and she went on and dumped the trash baskets and went back in. The next day, the superior called her and told her that the Holy Father wanted to see her. So she went over to see him, and he asked her many questions about herself and what she was doing there. And then he told her that he had a dream that there should be in the world a group of consecrated lay people. He felt that this was something that was going to come in the future. It was something that he very much wanted to see. He had written a rule of life for a person like this, and he believed that she was the person to initiate this. He said, now when the time comes for your community to renew their vows, I want you not to renew, but to leave, and I will take full responsibility before God for your soul. I want you to come to me on the day that your sisters are renewing, and I will offer Mass for you, give you this personal rule of life, and I want you to begin. So she did just this. She had been in the community about 25 years, and then suddenly she finds herself outside, and her family was not at all interested in having her back. The Pope did not live very much longer after that, and she was left out in the world with a rule of life, a family who didn't want her, and the Holy Father had told her that it might take her some years to find a priest who would be interested, but eventually she would find a priest. So she finally went to live with a married brother, his wife, and young daughter near Florence. She had to have some serious surgery, and the doctors told her that she had less than a 50-50 chance of living. So she destroyed the document that the Holy Father had given her, but it was well implanted in her mind. She recovered from the surgery. She never could find a priest who was interested in helping her with this far-out idea. At the end of World War I, when the flu epidemic broke out, this young niece had grown to university age by then, and she and this woman, Josephine Today, were very, very close friends. The niece came down with flu, and she died. But before she died, she said to her aunt, whom she called Aunt Peppina, "You have a secret which you have never really shared with anyone." Now, she had not shared it with the niece. The niece did not know. And she said, "There is in Milan a priest by the name of Father Gemelli. He is the priest to help you with the secret." And then the young girl died and left Aunt Peppina feeling that she should contact Father Gemelli, which she did, and she told Father Gemelli her story. He wrote to Armida Borelli and said, "The next time you go to Florence on Catholic Action business, go to see this Josephine Today. She's either crazy or she's a saint." So
Being a psychologist, he would say that.
Armida Borelli went to see Josephine, and largely our rule has been built on this rule of Leo XIII. This is the connection. Josephine was one of the first 12 who got together in 1919 in the little chapel of San Damiano, and from which the Institute has grown. Now, another one of the first 12 was a classmate of the niece of Josephine Today, and this is how this story has also come down to us. This classmate being Maria Stico, who is still living and is the author of that book over there, The Veil of the Heart. She was our second president and was the first directress of aspirants on our central council. She's quite a gifted author. She's now 83 years old, but very much with it. There's none of her faculties has been impaired at all. From the years 1919 through 1928, we were known as the family of Franciscan tertiaries for the social reign of the Sacred Heart. Basically, the rule that we were given to follow, while we implanted many of the ideas of Leo XIII, was basically the Third Order rule, because that was the only place where we could find any birth at all within the Church.
In the order.
Well, but as lay people, we didn't fit here and we didn't fit there, and the Holy Father had said we were to align ourselves with the Third Order, and certainly within the Franciscan Order, the place where we had to fit was with the Third Order. We wrote another rule at that time, but the Minister General rejected it in 1920, and he wrote a substitute rule for us. We did have live with the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but we did have really a priest as the superior. We had Armida Borelli was known as our big sister, a title that was taken over from her title in Feminine Youth, but we did not have the clear-cut lay administration that we have today. It's interesting to note too that before Pius XI was Pius XI, when he was a cardinal in Milan, he too was instrumental in bringing Father Gemelli into the faith, and remained a very firm friend of ours through his years as cardinal, and then when he came to be the Holy Father. It was Pius XI who gave us the title of the missionaries of the Kingship of Christ. It was also Pius XI who instituted the worldwide feast of the Kingship of Christ. He was very, very interested in us and promised that he would see that we received some sort of recognition. which we probably would have received had he not died, because we were very close to receiving a type of recognition. And between this period of 1928 and 1945, our life was changed so that we made only the one vow and 3 promises of poverty, obedience, and the apostolate. These were also renewed on an annual basis. At that time, we were given over to the Sacred Congregation of the Council, but we did retain our Franciscan affiliation and our Franciscan spirit. We knew from the very beginning that we wanted to be lay people, we wanted to be consecrated lay people, we wanted to follow the spirit of Francis. These were 3 of our characteristics that we never lost in spite of the many problems that we had. No one understood us because there was really no place for us in the church. If we were to take vows, they said we belonged with the Congregation of Religious. If we were going to be lay women, they said we belonged with the Sacred Congregation of the Council. And they kind of batted us back and forth like a ball between the 2 of them, and neither one really wanted us. Armida Borelli was told one time that what was not in the canon was not in the world, and her response was, well, we're in the world, but we're not in canon law, you see. And yet throughout this, we maintained very firm relationships with the Holy See. I think to this we owe this largely to the very good spirit of obedience that Father Gemelli had, that he handed down to us. Because he traveled so very much, he came to realize that there were similar groups growing up in various countries. He brought them together in the early 30s in St. Gall in Switzerland, and they formulated a document to be presented to the Holy See. The Holy See didn't want to have anything to do with it, and it was Father Gemelli who actually drew it up in its final form, and he sent it to the bishops of Italy. The Holy See asked him to withdraw this, and he did withdraw it. The missionaries were a little disturbed when it was withdrawn. They felt that it meant the withdrawal of the entire project. Yet they admired very much the spirit of obedience with which he withdrew that on which he had spent so much time. Interestingly enough, in the meantime, another one of the projects that Borelli and Gemelli had brought into being was this publishing house called the Opera della Regalità, which did very much to foster the liturgical revival of the church in the country of Italy. They felt that, and on a popular level, they felt that something was needed for all the people of Italy. They had this neoclassical review, Vita e Pensiero, for the higher level. Then they felt there was something that was needed for the multitude of people, and this was what would come out of the publishing house, Opera della Regalità. And then their third organism that they brought into being was the University of the Sacred Heart. But in and through the Opera della Regalità, they published many things, not only of a liturgical nature, but of a general religious nature. One of the missionaries working in the Opera della Regalità, after this document had been recalled, thought, oh, what tremendous wrapping paper to put some of our things that we're going to put up in storage. So she tore the sheets apart, wrapped a lot of things, and put it up in the attic. Before Pravda Mater Ecclesia came out, the Holy See got in touch with Gemelli and said, do you have that document? We want to use portions of it. Well, they had destroyed it all, they thought, but she went up in the attic and, by unwrapping enough packages, got together one issue which went back, and much of that went into Pravda Mater, so you can see how even our thinking has changed. But her act of not exactly obedience, not exactly disobedience, did bring about this other thing in the end. In 1945, the Sacred Congregation of the Council gave us some official recognition, and on a secular basis, we were permitted to use the title of the Laywomen's Association of the Sacred Heart. We still use a title similar to this, even here in the United States. We hold, for instance, we hold this property and anything else that we have under the secular title of the Laywomen's Association. We don't ever use the title Missionaries of the Kingship of Christ. We have always had or used discretion, which I believe is a better word than secrecy, as far as revealing our identity. And I think that this is a direct outgrowth of this period between 28 and 45, when Italy was under the domination of Mussolini and religion almost went out of existence. And it was impossible really to make yourself known and to identify yourself. Interestingly enough, too, any of the institutes that have come over from Europe and are now living and working in the United States do practice a degree of discretion. It's only any little group that has come up in the United States that wants everybody to know who it is. The institutes that are approved that began in Europe all practice discretion to a more or a lesser degree. And probably it's largely due to the fact that they grew up at a time when there was a type of discrimination, whether it was fascist or Nazi or what have you. When Mussolini came into existence, one of the things that he wanted to put out of existence was the Squilla, the paper of the feminine youth that was published by Armida Borelli. In fact, he did stop it, and the one reason it was permitted to function again, his brother was the publisher. And when they stopped publishing this, so many of his people were put out of work that his brother went to him and said, "You've got to let these Catholic Action people publish their paper so I can put my men back to work." And he said they can only publish it if they take out the byline of the organ of Catholic Action. Armida Borelli went to the Holy Father and he said, "Don't you dare take out the byline." So she goes back to Mussolini and says, "I went to my boss," and he says no. And so Mussolini said, "Okay, you can keep it the way it is." So it was published through Mussolini's regime with the official byline of "This is the official organ of Catholic Action." In 1945, the Sacred Congregation of the Council approved our Constitution for a 5-year period. We at that time were permitted only to make a vow of chastity, and we lived in the spirit of poverty and obedience. We took no promises.
Could I just say one thing? That congregation of the council, of course, did not have the competency to handle states of perfection. And they're the ones that forbade them to take these other, even to the binding promises of poverty and obedience, because they said that puts you in a different class. You're not under us. They wanted to keep them under their thumb. So the missionaries were practically forced into that situation, with which it'll never happen.
We always remain Franciscan. I think that it's interesting to note that from the very beginning, at least from 1928 on, we always have had lay superiors and we have had elected superiors. Our priests, we have called ecclesiastical assistants, and that is their point. I don't want to steal Father's talk either, but that is what we ask of them, religious assistants. In 1948, we were still living as this Laywomen's Association of the Sacred Heart. We were still living with the Constitution that had been approved for this 5-year period. When Pius XII said to us, "Aren't you going to ask for approval under Provida Mater Ecclesia?" We did ask for approval then, and we did very shortly thereafter receive a decree of praise. And we were the first Italian secular institute to receive pontifical approval. We were not the first, as Father said before, Opus Dei was the first. We show here on this chart a 4-year period, four periods within our history. I do believe that we should have another period, taking perhaps the period that began in 1950, certainly a new period that began in the year 1970, and this is why I would say this. It was in 1950 that the Institute first began to take on an international character. Up to that point, it was truly and totally an Italian institute. It spread very rapidly. It was an answer to what many of the people who had been fed spiritually in Catholic action groups, it was an answer to what they were looking for. It spread very rapidly. Today we are the largest of all the secular institutes, and now I'm talking only about the women. We number 4,000 around the world. And needless to say, over 3,000 of those are Italian, but our membership around the world is 4,000. You might wonder how the United States got into this. We had here in Washington, at the end of the war, a group of Josephs. The idea had come over from the Josephs in Belgium. We were mostly government workers, and we were trying to do as the Holy Father had asked in working, like with like. It was a very enterprising little group. I came into the group at the same time Father Stephen came into the group.
It was started already when you came.
Oh yes. There was the moderator of the group had been a friar from the monastery, and he was sent over to the Holy Land. He went down to Holy Name College to find a replacement and a successor for himself, and he found Father Stephen, who had returned. Who had returned from having studied in Europe not so long and so many years before that, and who had been interested in lay activity in Europe and had gone to see the Josephs in Belgium and so on. And it's just so happened Father's first meeting was my first meeting. I had been asked, I was a bacteriologist at the National Institutes of Health, and I had been asked by someone working out there to come to this meeting. I really didn't know what it was, but my first meeting and Father's first meeting was the same. The Josephs had an age limit of 25. After that, you were no longer a young Christian worker. So some of us also asked the question that had previously been asked in Italy: where do we go from here? One of our members decided that what she was supposed to do with her life was to enter the Poor Clares. So she had entered in the fall of 49. When she was cleaning out the rec room one day, she was reading some of the magazines, and in the Franciscan Herald, she found a little tiny advertisement for people who want to dedicate their lives to God but live in the world. Write to Father Gemelli, and it gave his address at the University of the Sacred Heart. She sent it down to Father Stephen and said, maybe this is what Barbara and some of the girls are thinking of, because we believe very much that while we wanted to dedicate our lives, it was not in a religious community. We all felt that our life was not geared for community living. So Father Stephen wrote to Father Gemelli and asked him for a rule and constitution and told him what our thinking was. He sent it back to us. And out of that, this all happened during the winter of 1949 and 1950, and out of that, we decided that we really should get together a Holy Year pilgrimage to go to Europe and to meet Father Gemelli and find out firsthand what this was all about. We didn't come to this conclusion until fairly late in the spring, and by that time you couldn't go by boat. Everybody was going by boat. Very few people were flying, so we decided if we were going to go, we had to fly. It was the only way we could get a free trip for Father. So there were 3 of us who were interested. We had to get 15 people together in order to get a free trip. And we got 14 people. One of the 3 was unable to go because of family responsibilities. We had 14 people and we couldn't get the 15th person. I tell you this because I think it's interesting to see the hand of God in all of this. The one who wanted very much to go but couldn't go was a night nurse. She lived near Catholic University in a house which she had recently purchased with her mother. One day she had just come home from being on night duty. She was still in her white uniform, and her doorbell rang. She went to answer the door, and there was a woman standing there, and she said, "Oh, I came to see Mrs. So-and-so." And Mary spoke up and said, "Oh, we bought the house from Mrs. So-and-so a few months ago. Mrs. So-and-so now has moved to Florida." And she said, "Oh, gee, isn't that too bad? When I went to Catholic U, I lived here with Mrs. So-and-so. I just wanted to come back and see her. I'm here for an alumni meeting." And Mary said to her, "Well, come on in and have a cup of coffee." So they began to talk, and she found out that this woman was a nurse, and Mary was a nurse, and that was the basis of conversation. And then the woman said something about she was going on a Holy Year pilgrimage. And Mary said, "Let me tell you about the pilgrimage that I know some friends of mine are having." And she told her about this pilgrimage and how wonderful this friar was and everything. And this woman said, "That's nice, but I've even put my down payment." And Mary said, "Well, let me take you up and introduce you to this friar." So the whole time the woman was saying, "No, I don't have to go." Mary was saying, "Oh, do come." So the next thing this woman knew, she was walking up the driveway to Holy Name College to meet Father Stephen. And the first thing she said to Father Stephen was, "I don't really know why I'm here. I've even put my down payment. I'm going with the Michigan Catholic nurses, and I've put my down payment." And Father says, "Well, it's nice to meet you," and so on. And they had a little chat, and that was it. She was teaching at Mercy College in Detroit and had cleared everything, but when she got back, she was told by the dean, the date of your return is 2 days after the opening of the school year, and if you go on that trip, it will nullify your contract. So she thought, wonder what I can do now. I wonder if those people have any room. So she called up, and when she called us up, we thought, here's our 15th person, see? We didn't want to be too anxious. We could hardly not be anxious enough, if you know what I mean, till we got her there. We didn't know a thing about her, except she wanted to go on a trip. We needed the 15th person. On the way over on the plane, it took a long time to fly over, in 1950, and we got well acquainted. On the way over, we discovered that she had many of the same ideas that we had. She wasn't a tertiary, but she was not at that time we had to be tertiaries. She was not at all against being one. So when we got her to Assisi, the first thing we did was put a cord and scapular on her in the Portiuncula and make her into a tertiary. And that's Stella, see. That's how we got our 4th member. Then Connie and I were living together in a house at that time, and Connie and I had gone to Europe. Mary Hatfield was the one who could not go. Connie and I were living with a 3rd girl whose name was Claudia, and she worked in the Census Bureau. Because it was the census year, she couldn't take any vacation until August. We were going in July. She was sort of interested in this, but really her leanings were to the Dominicans, and she actually afterwards became an Adrian Dominican nun. But she had a friend who had gone to the University of Minnesota with her. Now, this friend was not Catholic, and she said, "Would you have any objection if Kay and I joined you in Rome? At least we'll swell the crowd to 2 more people." At that point, we said, no, that would be fine. They joined us in Rome, and when we made the 4 Holy Year pilgrimages, to the 4 basilicas, Kay went with us, and in one of the basilicas she carried the cross, and every night the 15 of us and Father would get together in the hotel lobby and we'd say the rosary together. And so after we had made the 4 visits to the basilica, Kay said, "Now, you're all talking about Holy Year indulgences. What do I have to do to gain an indulgence?" "Oh," we said, "get baptized." And we were sort of kidding, but then she didn't say anything against that, so we thought, well, maybe this isn't such a bad idea. So as we traveled then around the Mediterranean and down to Nice and then over to Lourdes, every time we'd sit in a bus or a train, we'd manage to have Kay and Father Stephen sitting together. See? So by the time we got to Lourdes, Kay was ready to be baptized. And we baptized her in the font where Bernadette had been baptized, and she knelt on Bernadette's prie-dieu to receive First Holy Communion the next day. See? This is Father DePaul. Yeah. You know Father Barrett, and I know you know Father Richard and Father Matthias. And this is Father Theophane from Australia, and Father Robert from St. Paul, and Father Bert from Detroit. Mm-hmm. We're in the middle of the second session, Father, and I'm just telling them something about our history and how we began here in the United States. Well, after we had received Kay and baptized her, when she lived here in Washington, she's a lawyer. You know, you met her on Sunday. She became the sixth member of the Institute after about 3 years. And the fifth member of the Institute was Ruth. She was living with Stella out in Detroit, so that when Stella got back, in the meantime, when we got to Milan on this famous pilgrimage, the only thing we wanted to see in Milan was Father Gemelli. So Connie and Father Stephen and I tried to contact Gemelli and learned he was not in Milan, but was at the summer school in Piacenza. So we unceremoniously left the rest of the pilgrimage without any explanation, sightseeing in Milan, and we took the day and went out to see Father Gemelli. And spent the day with him out there. We did not realize at the time, but what we got into was a meeting of group leaders. And we did not meet Armida Borelli, although she was there, and she saw us. That, of course, was 1950, and she had just learned that she had a type of paralysis that eventually was to paralyze her entire body except for this little finger. But at that point, she could not speak, and they were taking very, very good care of her and not letting her overdo in any way. So she was when we talked to Gemelli, she was sitting in the next room, and she could look at us, and she could hear what we were saying, but we didn't know she was there, but she saw us. After we talked to Gemelli that day, he took us all into this large room where all these women were, and all we knew they were women, but they were group leaders. The thing that we did not realize at that time was that in the Institute, they had been praying to spread to foreign countries, and we answered this little ad, and we didn't know that we were the answer to their prayer, see? So they just greeted us, you know, as you would greet the answer to your prayer, and we couldn't imagine why they were so pleased to see us. One of the things that really floored the state Americans was they kissed us on both cheeks, and this was something that, you know, was tremendously foreign to us. And I'll never forget walking down this long line of people, you know, and being kissed on each cheek from each side as we walked out. It was really something. Well, they told us then that we should apply, you know, for admission. When we went to Rome, we had an audience with the Holy Father because Father Stephen was presenting him with a copy of the Psalms that had just been translated into English in the new translation. So we went with him to this audience, and we told him that he asked who we were, and we said that, you know, we were just tertiaries, but we wanted to start an institute in the United States. And he said, which one? And we said, Regalità. Oh, he said, that's a great institute. It has a lot of vitality. It's very much alive. He said, it's great. I'll give you my blessing. And we always felt that he really did give us our start. we wrote a letter and requested admission to the Institute, and they were so busy over there they never got around to answering it. So a year later we wrote another letter, and we told them we'd written a year before and they hadn't bothered to answer us. So they wrote back in 1951 and said, since you've been persevering for a year without any information from us, we'll consider that you, the 5 of you, have lived your first year of aspirancy, and we'll let you begin a second year of aspirants, which we did. So that the first professions in the United States then were in 1953. Armida Borelli died in 1952. And almost immediately, people wanted to begin to open her cause for canonization. Gemelli was very much against it, but the Cardinal of Milan was very much in favor of it, so that it was begun, the cause was opened a few years later, and actually is proceeding very well. If she would be the first lay woman, per se, to really reach the heights if we ever get it that far. Another interesting thing, I think, is the fact that until Cardinal Antonelli was made a cardinal, his office in the Sacred Congregation Cause of Saints was really as the devil's advocate. So every time her name came up, you know, he was on the opposite side of the fence. And we used to tease him at times about this. In 1970, the first zones were established. According